So welcome back, or welcome for the first time to day 2 of At the Margins. On our first session this morning, we're going to hear from Ellen Morris and Ilgi Gerçek. So to begin, we have Ellen Morris of Barnard College, who is going to give us a talk entitled On the Fringe Benefits of Life in the Shatter Zones of Egypt's Empire. So let's welcome Ellen. All set.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'd like to begin, of course, again by thanking Shane, Sarah, and Christian for organizing this conference and for this invitation to come together to think not so much about cores or peripheries, but about margins, borders, and buffers. For my own contribution to this theme, I'd like to consider Egypt's state and empire building projects, and specifically the role that the affordances of landscape played, both in determining and populating territory considered marginal to the state. In doing so, I'll be engaging ideas that James C. Scott has fleshed out in his recent book, Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States, as well as his 2009 book, The Art of Being Governed, an anarchist history of upland Southeast Asia. Central to Scott's thought is a single overarching idea, namely that agrarian states are expansionary, acquisitive, and exploitative. And because of this, among many people forced to live within them or in close proximity to them, they would have been deeply unpopular. In Egypt, a well-attested genre of scribal teaching texts derided practically every other profession, save that of the scribe, so as presumably to convince scribal students to stay in school. Indeed, when the determinative for the verb to teach was the same as that to beat, as it was in Egypt, the benefits of scribal training, it seems, bore repeating. The bleak view that Scott holds towards the ultimate ends of the state is in fact perfectly encapsulated in the description of the unenviable fate of the peasant. In the text, the writer first sets the scene, saying, "Have you not recalled the condition of the farmer faced with the registration of the harvest tax? The mice abound in the field, the locust ascends, the cattle devour, the sparrows bring want upon the farmer. The remainder that is on the threshing floor is almost at an end and is for the thieves, while the value of the hired cattle is lost, the yoke of oxen being dead on account of too much threshing and plowing." The scribe then moves to the consequences of this unhappy state of affairs for which the farmer is not himself responsible, but rather a victim of the gods, as it were. Of this, however, the state takes no note. The writer resumes, "Now a scribe has landed at the riverbank and is about to register the harvest tax. The enforcers carry staffs and the Nubian police rods of palm. They say, 'Give us grain,' although there is none. They beat furiously. The farmer is bound and thrown in a well. He's soused in a headlong dipping. His wife has been bound in his presence. His children are in fetters. His neighbors abandon them and are fled." Now, the central project of the state, Scott asserts, is to encourage the production of easily appropriable surplus by concentrating populations in what he terms grain and manpower modules, where a large proportion of surplus could be easily requisitioned. Grain is ideal from the state's perspective, he points out, because it ripens above ground, unlike tubers, for instance, which develop below ground and are thus easily hidden both from enemies and from representatives of the royal authority alike. And grain also has the virtue, again from the state's perspective, of ripening at a predictable time, such that scribes, tax collectors, and their armed enforcers might anticipate the exact moment to arrive on the scene to claim their cut of the peasant's labor. According to Scott, there is thus little mystery as to why the world's first states, Mesopotamia, China, and Egypt, arose in fertile river valleys that lent themselves to the production of a product that offered so much in the way of caloric value. They ripened in such a convenient manner that could be transported so cheaply and easily by boat, and that was finally so eminently appropriable, lending itself as it did to long-term storage. And although Scott never focuses upon Egypt specifically, he would not have been at all surprised to learn that shortly following the establishment of the state, and for many centuries thereafter, one finds inscriptional evidence for walled estates populated by so-called royal colonists, nor by the fact that these state farms were in fact frequently paired together with watchtowers, as you can see from the profusion of red boxes on this map. Such towers, Scott would no doubt suggest, were almost certainly constructed not to keep enemy raiders out, but to prevent individuals like the unlucky peasants' neighbors in the scribal satire from fleeing to the margins of the state, i.e. to realms less fiscally legible and/or accessible to its veritable army of bureaucrats and enforcers. So in my talk this morning, I'd like to take a look at three such geographic regions of refuge, or as Scott calls them, shatter zones. Two of these zones, namely marshes and deserts, lay in or adjacent to Egypt proper. The other, firmly ensconced in the mountains of Lebanon, lay at the fraught and fraying margins of Egypt's empire in the New Kingdom. All three of these environments were not only difficult to control physically, but also difficult to appropriate fiscally. Therefore, they were ideal places into which to flee the state, as well as places to occupy if you had always existed free from the levies of the state and desired to continue doing so. Moreover, as we shall see, such shatter zones afforded the fostering of predatory economies, as well as profit for those who could leverage their position at the margin of more than one state to their own benefit. Let me begin then with a consideration of marshes. The marshes of Egypt's Nile Delta have the dubious distinction of having served as regions of refuge not only for humans, but so too for their divine counterparts. In Egyptian mythology, for instance, evil entered the world when the god Seth killed his brother Osiris, the rightful and good king of Egypt, and consigned their mutual sister, Osiris's wife Isis, to toil in perpetuity in a spinning house. Because unbeknownst to Seth, she had in fact conceived a legitimate heir to Osiris's throne, she was forced to flee to the only region in Egypt where she could remain hidden from her brother's agents while she gave birth to her son Horus in a secluded island in the midst of the marshes. Despite the dangers posed by scorpions, crocodiles, snakes, and other noxious creatures, she kept herself and her son safe. And like later mortal counterparts, she was able also to bide her time until it became politically feasible to contest control of the country. The almost unparalleled ability of marshes to provide refuge for fugitives and insurgents is beautifully illustrated in the Assyrian relief, which shows Chaldean fugitives hiding from Sennacherib's soldiers in the marshes of Iraq. Incidentally, as a testament to the endurance of affordances over the longue durée, in the 1990s, these same marshes were targeted by the armies and engineers of Saddam Hussein because they sheltered Iraq's Maidan, or marsh Arabs, who were notoriously resistant to the imposition of state control in general, and to his regime in particular. Thus, Saddam Hussein, in true dictatorial form, made it a priority, quite literally, to drain the swamp in order to eradicate his enemies. If one is alert then to the propensity of marshes to afford refuge for fugitives and all those intent on evading the imposition of state control, then it is perhaps little surprise that the first enemy of the state, memorialized in records and monuments, was primarily identified by his intimate tie to the marshes. And while it might be argued that the marshes simply served as a bland signifier for the delta, it is surely significant that Narmer's enemy wore only a bare modicum of clothing, as denizens of the marshes typically did, and was depicted as hooked by the nose, as if he were a hippo. Clearly then, for Narmer, his conquest could not be considered complete until his enemies had been ferreted out from all their hiding places. And ferreting out enemies hiding in the marshes seems to have been a regularly recurring challenge for Egypt's rulers, particularly during times when the state was weak or under threat, for the marshes served as extremely effective locales from whence to wage guerrilla warfare. One might think, therefore, of the trouble that Artaxerxes faced quelling a revolt that started in 459, led by two men, Amyrtaeus, who was designated the king of the marshes, and Inaros, who could also be referred to as chief of the rebels or chief of the Bacaloi. And this is the first attestation of a term that in the 2nd century CE designated swamp-dwelling troublemakers whose numbers swelled tremendously due to debilitating taxes imposed by the Romans, but more on that in a second. What's notable is that the population that paid allegiance to these two men must have been viewed as formidable enough that even when the Persians quelled the revolt and captured these men, their sons were allowed to remain in power. In hindsight, of course, this was unwise, for it would be Amyrtaeus' grandson and namesake who would emerge like Horus from the marshes to defeat Artaxerxes II and throw off Persian rule for what would amount to a little over half a century. So before we leave the marshes for the desert, let me quickly mention the bukuloi, a term that came from the Greek word for herdsman, but which doubled in the context of the Nile Delta, at least, as a word for bandit. This social grouping played a prominent role in both fact and fiction in the mid-2nd century CE, but the context for the rapid escalation in their numbers under Roman governance predates this period. Already in the 1st century CE, the Alexandrian philosopher Philo had remarked on a vicious cycle whereby Egyptian peasants who fled Roman tax collectors because they could not pay found their wives, children, parents, and other relatives round up and beaten, like the characters in the aforementioned scribal satire, until they would either give up the whereabouts of the fugitives or pay off their debt. According to Philo, quote, "When there were no kinsmen left, the maltreatment was passed on to their neighbors and sometimes even to villages and cities, which quickly became desolate and stripped of their inhabitants, who left their homes and dispersed to places where they expected to remain unobserved." And these places, of course, often included the marshes. By the mid-2nd century, this problem was exacerbated due to the famines and plagues that had depopulated the countryside, and especially to the Roman policy of redistributing tax burdens among the remnants of a sorely depleted population. Thus, documentary records attest that it was not uncommon for entire villages to be depopulated and for their populations to flee to the predatory margins of the state. Thus, they became bukuloi, a term that now encompassed not only herdsmen and bandits, but increasingly newly minted nationalist insurgents. In 172 CE, the bukuloi fomented a full-scale insurrection, which the government had an especially difficult time stamping out due to the fact that, as in all guerrilla warfare, it required differentiating villagers that were covertly supporting the rebels from those that in fact suffered from their depredations. Moreover, in both fact and fiction, the bukuloi were led by a priest who, to hear Cassius Dio put it, caused the rest of the Egyptians to revolt. In sum, what made the bukuloi so difficult to eradicate was that they operated in relatively small bands at the margins of society. These groups were highly mobile, had a predatory economy in addition to their more legitimate cover as cattle herders, and were regularly replenished with recruits due to the state's own exploitative practices. As a character intent on tracking down members of the bukuloi in Heliodorus' Ethiopian story described his quarry, quote, "They are the most dangerous of all beasts. Men they are called herdsmen, though the life they lead is one of brigandry, and it is almost impossible to run them to the ground as they retreat into their dens and lairs in the marsh." Now, if one were to imagine a landscape that was the polar opposite of the marsh, it would undoubtedly be the desert. Yet it is fascinating in this respect to find that Egypt's deserts offered many of the same affordances as regions of refuge, insurgency, and banditry, as did marshes. In a text known as the Instructions for Mary Kara, the narrator had this to say about Bedouin. The vile Asiatic is miserable because of the place wherein he is. Shortage of water, lack of many trees, and the paths thereof difficult because of the mountains. He is never settled in one place, but plagued by want, he wanders the deserts on foot. He's been fighting ever since the time of Horus. He neither conquers nor can he be conquered. He does not announce the day of fighting, but is like a thief whom society has expelled. Now, it is, of course, exceedingly difficult to tax a people who won't stay still, and so the highly mobile lifestyle of the Bedouin likely had a logic that was not purely practical, but was also, to some extent, defensive. By inhabiting desert regions where entrance by the uninitiated often spelled death, and by adopting a purposeful poverty, Bedouins seem throughout the ages to have actively sought to keep states at bay. The 19th century explorer Giovanni Belzoni described Eastern Desert Bedouin as, quote, lovers of freedom. They prefer living among these solitary rocks and deserts where they eat nothing but dora and drink water before submission to the command of any government on earth. It is a great feast among them when they take the resolution of killing a lean goat, but they eat it without fearing that any rapacious hands should take it from them. A man of this stamp, accustomed to liberty and independence, would naturally find himself in prison if under the control of even the best of governments. What occasional contact with Bedouin thus offered sedentary Egyptians was an alternate model of how to live in this world, a model which must have appealed to many who felt oppressed by the rules, regulations, and heavy tax burdens of the state. Indeed, Bruce Williams, anticipating James Scott, has suggested that the so-called walls of the ruler military defenses at the edges of Egypt's eastern delta likely served far more often to keep Egypt's populace in than it did to keep others out. Extrapolating from the totals of fugitives recorded in a single Middle Kingdom papyrus, Williams estimated that roughly 4,000 people a year, or as many as 40,000 over the course of a decade, likely attempted to flee Egypt for places such as Canaan, where all governments appear to have been small-scale and local. And in this regard, it is extremely fitting that the first individual that we know of who successfully evaded the armed guards that monitored the so-called walls of the ruler was not a foreigner sneaking into Egypt, but rather an admittedly fictional Egyptian courtier attempting to flee the country due to his fear of being implicated in a recent regicide. Significantly, after he managed to avoid the border guards and crossed part of the Sinai on foot, he found himself at the point of perishing due to thirst. Instead, however, he was rescued by the timely arrival of a group of Bedouin who revived him with water and with boiled milk. The leader of this group had at some point paid a diplomatic visit to Egypt's court and thus recognized him. Yet despite the fact that he no doubt appreciated the reward he would reap from marching Sinuhe straight back to the guards he had so recently evaded, the Bedouin elected instead to abet his escape. As the fugitive put it, I went with him to his tribe, and what they did for me was good. Indeed, if archaeology and ethnohistory have anything to add to this story, it is that Bedouin typically utilized their position in the shatter zones of the state to their full advantage, not only to harbor its fugitives, but more fundamentally to prey upon its messengers and caravans should functionaries of the state dare to traverse their territory without permission. Thus, savvy Egyptians, in virtually all periods for which we possess information, seem to have found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to hire for protection the very same category of individual that usually preyed upon them. And things were much the same in this regard in the highlands of Egypt's northern empire in the New Kingdom, which brings us to our third and final shatter zone, mountains. Now, in addition to provisioning their own palace-based elites, Levantine peasantry in the New Kingdom had to support an Egyptian imperial apparatus that extracted annually, it appears, thousands of jars of wine, hundreds of jars of incense, hundreds of head of cattle, and hundreds of people, not to mention heaps of grain and tremendous quantities of wood. The prevalence of a widely dispersed population of freebooters, designated as Apiru in the documentary evidence, strongly suggests that an increasing number of valley peoples had opted out of a dutiful life under their nested layers of overlords and had effectively headed for the hills. There, as it often happened, they elected to serve in the militias of men who operated predatory polities, individuals that in today's parlance could easily be termed warlords. Let me focus by way of example on the rulers of Amuru, who launched repeated raids on coastal cities from their bases in the mountains of Lebanon. One particularly notable feature of their recruitment strategy is that they attracted potential Apiru, not yet extracted from their status as citizens of a particular city-state, to join their entourages by deploying the rhetoric of freedom, urging them to revolt against their leaders and be at peace like the Apiru, or else to defect from their cities altogether and join the Apiru. Mountains, like deserts and marshes, were difficult for Egyptians to penetrate and also relatively bereft of easily appropriated natural resources or wealth, and thus they made perfect shatter zones. Indeed, getting back to the notion of the affordances of landscape, while mountains do not lend themselves to agriculture, they do afford banditry and targeted strikes. Certainly, we know that raids by the men of Amuru on Byblos's grain stores were one factor in that town's revolt against its ruler. Mountains also facilitate kidnapping and ambushes on caravans and other high-value targets. Thus, the rulers of Amuru were able to leverage extraordinary influence with Egypt because of their potential to interfere with Egypt's access to a crucial mountain pass that led from Sumer to Kadesh. Moreover, the Egyptians found themselves hard put to discipline them, even in the face of bald lies and only thinly disguised acts of sedition. For the men of Amuru were not only on the margins of the agricultural lowlands and rich harbors, they were also on the margins of at least two other imperial powers. Thus, ironically, by being on the margins of each, the polity of Amuru was in fact of central importance to all, and as such, its rulers could afford to play one power off its rivals for their own benefit. And here, too, James Scott would find parallel with the highlands of Thailand, where he says, "Many hill peoples and petty chieftaincies strategically manipulated the situation of dual sovereignty, quietly sending tributary missions to two overlords and representing themselves to their own tributaries as independent. Small kingdoms were often identified as under two lords or under three lords in the Thai language." While managing this competing constellation of relationships no doubt brought headaches, it also almost assuredly was quite lucrative. For we find the rulers of Amuru, for instance, pledging allegiance to Egypt while surreptitiously wining and dining Hittite ambassadors. Thus, they may simultaneously have been paid by Egypt to protect the grain stores at the base of Sumer, and perhaps by the Hittites to assassinate that king's governor. As all parties were well aware, it was the diplomatic right of a vassal to choose his stable. Thus, each power must have felt that partial rights to the loyalty of a somewhat untrustworthy vassal were preferable to having an avowed enemy in the very same strategic position. Thus, at one point, when Akhenaten had expressed anger in a letter to the ruler of Amuru, the latter felt secure enough to issue thinly veiled threats of his own. For instance, in one missive, he followed an elaborate assertion of loyalty with a rhetorical question. But if the king, my lord, does not love me and rejects me, then what am I to say? And here, of course, one can think quite easily of recent wars in Afghanistan, in which mountain warlords located in the key strategic border zone between Afghanistan and Pakistan found themselves courted by these two governments, Al-Qaeda, the Americans, and later the Taliban, each, no doubt, offering cash for collaboration. Indeed, the Afghans even have formulated an adage concerning their proven willingness to fight for those that pay and to switch their loyalties if a better offer arises. No one can own us, they say. They can only hire us. At such times and places, then, the fringe benefits of life in the shatter zone for those willing to weather its many dangers are easily apparent. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Just like yesterday, we're going to hold questions and comments until the end. So now I would like to welcome Ilgi Gerçek of Bill Kent University, who will be presenting the short arm of the state, power, participation, and resistance in Hittite frontiers. So please join me in welcoming Ilgi. Good.
I would like to begin, as others, with thanking the organizers for inviting me here. It's been wonderful to be here to listen to everybody's work and to share ideas. Thank you again. It's a wonderful conference. Hittite archives allow us to study frontiers through the lens of a rich and diverse body of textual sources. These sources include historiographic texts that propagated royal interests and perspectives, normative documents presenting an ideal view of frontiers and their administration, as well as archival documents that reveal what actually happened at the margins of central authority. The archaeological evidence has also been growing with new surveys and excavations in Hittite borderlands. Accordingly, recent years have seen the publication of several studies on the frontiers of the Hittite state, focusing on their history, historical geography, administration, socio-political dynamics, and archaeology. The present paper will shift the focus from the landscape and territoriality, which Ilgi dealt with skillfully, to the social landscape. I will pursue two distinct but overlapping lines of inquiry. I will investigate, on the one hand, borderland and marginal communities, cities, and polities in Hittite Anatolia, their socio-political organizations, and when apparent, their economic strategies and cultural distinctions. On the other hand, I seek to trace the shape and reach of Hittite sovereignty by examining the structures of governance, local agency, and the range of mutually structuring interactions between the Hittite state, its agents and subjects, and non- or anti-state groups at the margins of the state's core territory, the Hittite homeland. As for the geographical and chronological focus of the present paper, the discussion will focus on the Hittite homeland, the area under the effective control of the Hittite state, known as Hatti, and its borderlands, in the early empire and empire periods. This will be a text-based study in the end, as the texts are what I know best, though I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A any questions that rise from the available archaeological evidence. The methodological challenges of my inquiry will be familiar to this audience. The textual evidence is generated almost entirely by the Hittite state and its officials, and thus present the state's perspective and interests. These documents need to be read against the grain, to borrow Seth Richardson's wording, to extract the kind of information we seek. The archaeological evidence, too, presents its own challenges. There are considerable stretches of central Anatolia that remain archaeologically understudied. And moreover, surveys, which provide most of our evidence on the frontiers of Hatti, are best equipped to identify so-called Hittite, or to use the preferred terminology, North Central Anatolian material culture, especially pottery. Therefore, they too have focused, perhaps unintentionally or out of necessity, on the presence, structures, behavior, and material culture of the state. There is also the related problem of whether the presence of North Central Anatolian material culture should signal the exclusive presence and uncontested authority of the Hittite state, which I will not be able to deal with here. I can't see what I'm... Oh, all right. I would like to draw your attention to a particular group of documents that will figure prominently in the present paper. These documents may be described as official agreements or contracts that sought to delineate and regulate the relationship between the Hittite state, its sovereign and officials, and a variety of marginal communities represented by a single ruler or some type of collective representative body. They have all been found in the archives of the capital, Hattusa. Hittitologists have traditionally assigned these documents to different genres, such as treaties, protocols, instructions, and loyalty oaths, and classified them into two main categories: internal state administration and international state or vassal treaties. But those who produced these documents actually lumped them together in the same typological and functional category, referring to them by their principal constituents, ischiol and or lengai, literally a bond, which denoted obligation, instruction, contract or treaty, and the oath. In other words, international or domestic are conceptual and terminological distinctions not applied by those who produced the sources. And despite variations in content and form, a group of documents among the Ischiol and Lengai genre concern communities that inhabited the margins of central authority. In some cases, the individuals or communities involved in these documents are identified by their towns or regions, which we know to be peripheral to Hatti. And in others, the contents of the text explicitly mention their position in borderlands. I will refer to this collection of documents as agreements, and though not perfect, this term at least acknowledges both sides involved in these contractual interactions. Some of the communities involved in these agreements were marginal, not geographically, or not only geographically, but in terms of their position vis-à-vis the state. We may consider, for instance, Lumesh Gaz, traditionally understood as Hapiru, who appear in a late Old Kingdom or early Empire period agreement that is unfortunately very fragmentary. And here you see on the screen a non-exhaustive list of some of the best preserved documents, though there are many, many fragments which can be ascribed to this group of documents. These agreements inform us about the people who lived at the margins of the Hittite polity, their names, their towns, their institutions, socio-political organizations, and their manifold interactions with the Hittite polity, with which they were willingly or unwillingly entangled. These agreements and the communities they concerned cannot be classified as internal or external, international, precisely because the community's status as subjects, subordinates, allies, or enemies was in constant flux. Aside from the agreements, I will also frequently refer to a collection of about 100 texts unearthed at Mashatuyuk, Hittite Topeka, which was a town located on the northeastern frontier of the Hittite homeland. This corpus contains mostly letters pertaining to the administration of this region, as well as a handful of administrative documents. This corpus is a unique and excellent window into the lived realities in a Hittite borderland. And to frame my inquiry and to facilitate comparison, let us look briefly at the borderlands of Hittite territory, following Hittite conceptualizations of the homeland, its limits, and its administration. This section will overlap a little bit with what Alvise told us about yesterday. The Hittite polity, as other polities in the ancient world, and as was illustrated yesterday, is best viewed as a flexible territorial structure bounded by ambiguous frontiers rather than clearly demarcated boundaries. However, a keen sense of homeland was central to Hittite political and religious ideology. Both the Hittite polity and the Hittite homeland, that is, the core territory under direct Hittite control, were known by the Hittites and their contemporaries as the land of the city Hattusa, more commonly written acatographically as the land of Hatti. As a territory, the land of Hatti lacks clear geographical definition in both Hittite sources and modern studies on Hittite historical geography. With the capital Hattusa at its center, it appears to have corresponded roughly to the Kızılırmak River basin and was often juxtaposed in Hittite texts with other lands in Anatolia, such as the Upper Land, Kaska, Luka, or Artsava. The next concept of interest to us is the border or borderland. The Hittite word arha, irha, often represented by the Sumerogram tzag, conflates two meanings. One, that of a boundary or a dividing line separating two regions or entities, and two, that of a region, a three-dimensional zone, best rendered in English as borderland or frontier. Arha irha could also, by extension, denote the entire territory that it enclosed. Beginning in the early empire period, frontiers constituted a special category in the territorial organization and provincial administration of the Hittite state. Frontier districts were perceived to be distinct from the rest of rural Hatti and were subject to special regulations closely monitored by the king. Note, for instance, the distinction held between a man of the border and a man of Hatti. Hantetsi Auri, literally a primary or front-facing post or watchtower, was often used in reference to entire territories and should be translated as frontier in its sense of an interface between the known and unknown, tame and untame, or between one polity or another, as you see in the example right below it. The most significant administrative unit in a frontier district were the Auri, Awari, watchtower, understood to mean frontier post, which were situated at Hatti's interfaces with potentially hostile territories. The key figure in the administration of frontier districts was the Aurias Isha, Akkadian Balmad Galtu, frontier governor who performed civic, military, judicial, and cultic duties. Frontier districts were subject to a specific set of regulations that prioritized issues of security, the maintenance of fortresses and fortified towns in frontier regions, gathering intelligence concerning enemy activities, the restriction of mobility of fugitives or transhumant populations, the extraction of goods and services, and the mobilization of workforce for military campaigns or other infrastructural projects. What the textual and archaeological evidence makes abundantly clear is that Hittite territory, particularly towards the fringes of the heartland, was honeycombed with areas, towns, or groups not subject to the Hittite state. Especially in the peripheries, Hittite control was often limited to some towns and routes of communication, as has been observed for many late Bronze Age polities. Frontiers were clearly perceived in the Hittite world as dangerous territories peopled by fugitives and dissidents, deportees brought in by Hittite rulers, as well as indigenous populations. In the following two excerpts from the document known as the Instructions and Loyalty Oath Impositions for Lords, Princes, and Courtiers, it's a long name, King Totalia IV voices his anxieties concerning the frontiers of the Hittite heartland, particularly about enemy activity and the defection of his subjects. It is puzzling, at least to me, that descriptions of foreign lands, peoples, and customs are infrequent in Hittite texts and entirely absent in Hittite art. Imaginary or mythical lands are similarly underrepresented in Hittite documentation. The lands adjacent to Hatti were simply called Araxena, surrounding or neighboring in the aggregate. Araxena is primarily a spatial designation, meaning surrounding, bordering, neighboring, external or outer, and could mean foreign only by extension and in some contexts. It was a neutral term, unless used together with words denoting hostility, such as kurur or kurura. And we cannot find in Hittite documentation overtly disparaging, belittling remarks on specific groups. Foreigners or enemies were not demonized or exoticized. Moreover, the dangerous or uncanny was not necessarily confined to peripheral or distant lands, but began right outside of the city wall and stretched all the way to the mountains which dominate the Anatolian landscape. Having summarized the presence of the states in its margins, in the time that remains I will address the people who lived at the margins of a centralized imperial polity, or rather the people who had a centralized imperial polity at their margins, and how they interacted with this polity and how these interactions affected everyone involved. We may identify, going back to these agreements, the following actors who entered into agreements with the Hittite state. We have the elders of a town or region, a collective representing their communities. Similarly, a group called tapariales seem to have fulfilled a similar role to the elders as leaders of their towns or districts. I have preferred to translate this term as leader or even ruler rather than the traditional translation governor or sometimes even chieftain, since the latter, governor, implies that a tapariale was appointed by the Hittite ruler, which most often was not the case. In a lot of instances, we find a group of men or troops with or without named leaders who engaged with the Hittite state. Unlike the elders or leaders, the groups of men and troops were often not collective representatives of their communities, but were employed by the Hittite state for various projects. I will return to this later. A foremost element common to practically all extant agreements was loyalty to the Hittite sovereign, his appointed successor, and the royal family, military alliance, and the reporting of anti-state behavior to the agents of the Hittite state, or when it was the agents of the Hittite state, like the frontier governments who were involved in sedition, reporting them to the Hittite king. However, each group or individual had a different set of obligations, different agendas, benefits, and related differently to the Hittite state. In some agreements, as mentioned, the elders and leaders of a town or district represented their communities and seemed to have the power to determine their community's political status as the state's allies, if not subordinates, the distinction is sometimes not very clear, or enemies. Men or troops of a certain town or regions, with or without named leaders, as I said, were often employed temporarily, or it seems permanently, on specific projects. While yet other groups, they can be called, again, men or troops in these texts, were integrated into state orders completely. So we see here a spectrum of allies, to employees, subordinates, and subjects, maybe to citizens. Though traditional historical narratives often see these agreements as impositions on marginal communities, usually effected at the wake of a Hittite military campaign, a closer look at these documents reveal that while a number of them were indeed imposed upon recently and forcefully subordinated communities, some communities actually sought to enter into agreements with the Hittite state willingly. You see here the examples in bold. They have already made an agreement, or Kashka men are coming here in large numbers to make an agreement. I would like to note that the verb translated here as to make an agreement has traditionally been translated as to make peace, which I think entirely misses the point, as tax means to bind. They're actually making a contract with the Hittite king. Some groups renegotiated extant agreements with the state. The agreements made by the men of Ismerica, a town in the south, or town or region in the south, in or close to Kizzuwatna, suggests that the obligation of the men of Ismerica to supply troops was reduced from 150 to 60, which I would argue reflects unwillingness on the part of the men of Ismerica and their power to negotiate with the Hittite king. In the same treaty, the men of Ismerica are given the right to police the territory they are assigned to in Kizzuwatna and confiscate the goods of those involved in criminal behavior. By the extension of the right to use legitimate violence, I would argue that the men of Ismerica were integrated into state orders. Often, towns or regions would flat out refuse to supply troops for the Hittite king. The annals of Mushili II are replete with references to refusals to give troops, which was used as a justification to carry out military campaigns against certain communities, towns, or territories. Yet other groups or troops stayed in the employ of the Hittite state for significant stretches of time. We can trace, for instance, the involvement of the troops of Isupita, a town or region in the northern frontier zone, not too far from Mashatuuk, from the early empire period to the very late empire period. These groups first appear in an agreement by the king Arnuwanda I with various groups from the north. They are called Kashka in the aggregate, in which they take an oath, seemingly at the time of their employment. We see them slightly later in the Mashat letters, where they're employed as fighting units and agricultural workers. Later still, in the annals of Mushili II, Isupita is mentioned among the towns that refused to supply troops. And finally, in one of the so-called cult inventories, possibly from the reign of Tutalia IV, the very end of the empire, we find a reference to the same troops of Isupita making a religious offering to the gods of Topeka. This shows that the troops of Isupita were employed by the state for more or less 2 centuries and maintained formed their distinct identity. The men or troops who made agreements with the ruler were employed to fulfill a range of duties, some of which were not mutually exclusive. They could be used as fighting units, scouts, guides, or spies, as agricultural laborers or as workforce in the state's infrastructural projects, or they could be employed as herdsmen, providers of salt, or engaged in mercantile activities. The same communities, or others, could also engage in a range of generally anti-state or specifically anti-Hittite behavior. Several communities sought to achieve or maintain autonomy through warfare, or more commonly and more successfully through the time-honored and, I suspect, more sustainable strategy of evasion. Here you see one of my favorite examples from the Mashat letters, where the king reprimands his official Kashu for not being able to spot the enemy. He says, "So, was the enemy enchanted that you did not recognize him?" Others, on the other hand, sought to switch their political allegiance from one ruler to the other. As you can see here, the leaders and the elders of Pitasa are swearing an oath against his enemy, and later on, in another document, a certain Marua, called the ruler or man of Himua, is capitulating to the enemy, changing his allegiance from the Hittite ruler to the enemy mentioned in this document. More commonly, though, violent or non-violent forms of resistance were motivated by economic reasons, as we can infer from the innumerable references to withholding due tribute or troops, pilfering grain silos or livestock. The following excerpts from 2 administrative letters from Mashatuuk are cases in point and also show the scale of some of these activities. It is important to stress here that the state, too, engaged in the same kinds of small-scale brigandage. Hittite troops regularly attacked silos, stole cattle, or took hostages and later bartered them. Hittite imperialism and attempts to thwart it had a considerable impact on the socio-political organization of frontier communities. A treaty between Shupililiuma I and Hukana of Hayasa illustrates the changes in the political organization of the region Hayasa, sometimes also called Atsi. "I took you up, Hukana, a lowly dog, and treated you well," he says. "And I distinguished you among the men of Hayasa." Shupililiuma claims here to have installed Hukana in a superordinate position over the men of Hayasa. And indeed, this treaty includes, as an appendix, sections of an earlier accord, which is addressed not to Hukana, but the men of Hayasa, a collective body. And interestingly, whereas Hukana is not addressed as king in this treaty, in the annals of Mushili II, which comes later, we find a reference to Ania, the king of Atsi, referring to the same region. We observe a similar process at work among the Kashka, which was a collective term for the diverse inhabitants of the northern fringes of the empire and beyond, who were not subject to Hittite control most of the time. In this particular statement, we see an awareness on the Hittite side of a Kashka manner of rule which was not monarchical, and of the changing socio-political structure of the Kashka, which we may attribute to their interactions with the Hittite Empire. The margins of Hatti were peopled by communities with diverse socio-political organizations, economic strategies, cultural traits. The way they interacted with the Hittite polity varied from place to place and time to time. These people have long appeared in our narratives as passive groups at the receiving end of Hittite imperial aggression and consolidation, or as aggressors who continuously harried Hittite territories. I have tried to demonstrate that these people, in actuality, altered the very shape and extent of the state through their cooperation with the state or its agents, through endless negotiations of their obligations and rights, or through their rejection of state authority. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ilgi. I'd like to welcome Ellen back up, and we'll open it up for discussion. I do want to remind everyone, if you ask questions, that we are live streaming again, and Megan may be taking questions as well. So we'll open it up now.
I think your analysis seems a lot similar to what Valeria was discussing yesterday, this idea of these hostile environments at the kind of at the fringes of what is Egypt. So do you see any kind of political text where the king mentions this kind of hostility towards the state or his power from the marshes?
Right. Trying to you certainly get kind of attacks coming from the desert that need to be dealt with. It's hard often because this type of social organization is so fluid, and because the carrying capacity of some of these environments is relatively small, that you almost get the sense that the fact that, Narmer's enemy was labeled as, it's almost an anomaly to have an actual named person. But you do, I guess the closest might be in the reign of Merneptah and then Ramses III, you get Libyans coming into the Delta, and there you have, these named rulers who have to be chased off and degraded, and who are, very much kind of the margins. In fact, they're both of the marshes and of the desert by virtue of where they came from and the lifestyle they took up. It's interesting.
I try to focus on two questions for Ilgi. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alan, as well. This is really the research we share. Let me address the question to Ilgi. One is more general, and starting from the instruction and the wealth of evidence that you have put together, do you consider the Kashka as, I just put the big name, as part of the state or as opposition to the state? I think that this is an important. The second is more specific and is serious about the Taparialis and the way you interpreted that. I would favor enormously your interpretation because, as you know, the continuity in Anatolia is the Taparialis.
Yes.
So in the Anatolian hieroglyphic, and I try to write that Tabal and so on derives from Taparia, Tapala, and so on. I would love it. And however, Taparia means order. It's just like the imperial mandatum in Latin. So I always thought the other way around, that the Taparialis are sort of mashkin, so people sent there from the core. How can we get having them representatives of the peripheries? Thank you.
Thank you for both questions. I like them very much. About the Kashko and whether they are part of the state or not, this is something I've been trying to wrap my head around for a long time. But the problem is they are called Kashka when they're not part of the state. When they are behaving in or on the verge of allying themselves. So a governor might say, some of the Kashka are coming here to take an alliance, but when they are taking these oaths, they're called the troops of Isupita, the troops of Kamama, and then later on we don't.
At Kadesh.
Those are, yes, they employed as mercenaries and then sent over to that. So it's one of the rare instances. And then the Egyptian references are all half. There's no single word Kashka that's actually preserved there in the correspondence. So I think they could willingly interact with the state to different extents, and they could at times, like I suspect the men of Ishupita, stay in the employ of the state for very long times. But I think that the state also struggled with how to label them, whether they were subordinates or not, and they could easily shift that alliance, and that's the exact point of that. They live in a region where they can shift their alliance very easily, and did, and we see that time and again. About the Tapariales, this is, I've been tracking all the non-Iron Age attestations of this word, and I haven't yet been able to find a single attestation where it's clear that they are working as governors of the Hittite king. I mean, more archival work at Mainz probably is going to clear that out, but there is, when you see that document, it says, the elders of the community and their tapariales are, urging their communities to change alliance. They were people who could, these were not people, not necessarily people installed by the Hittite king, but they had some position within their communities, which, the two are not necessarily exclusive, but that's why I think these were leaders of their communities, and that's why I think that the same connotation continued to the Iron Age, where they are actually leaders. So I hope that answered.
I have a question, a comment for Ilgi as well. I couldn't agree more with your assessment of it being a really fluid situation. And I think some of the new archaeological evidence that's coming out of Oymaj is really supporting this idea, but not only of the fluidity of the Kaska, the people beyond, and how they come into contact with institutions that could be considered tied, or really is Oymaj that much tied into the Hittite state as we assume it is? I'm not sure, because when you look at the material culture there, it's also very fluid. It's kind of Hittite, but there are other new types of ceramics.
Yes, wheel-made ceramics.
And so does that interaction also make, I guess I get into my question, does that interaction, in your opinion, also make the communities that are perhaps more firmly or at least officially associated with the Hittite state apparatus, does that interaction with the Kaska, that situation on the margin, makes them fluid also, and potentially shift over occasionally onto the other side?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the actual question.
So when you look at Oymaj, for instance, you have material that is clearly late Bronze Age, but it's clearly not what we associate with Hittite material culture. At the same time, the material culture that we could think of as North Central Hittite related also is quite idiosyncratic, or has idiosyncratic aspects to it. And then if you think of maybe the local king at Kushakle, Versa, so what I'm trying to get at is, does the interaction with the other, with the Kaska, whatever they really are in terms of their local manifestation, do you think that that also creates more of a fluid situation for those people who are more officially associated with the state in these marginal areas?
I think it does, and there's good textual and now archaeological evidence for that. And we see that, scholarship has traditionally assigned these people a role as, mountain tribes and, people who lack cities or any kind of political organization that may be at some level comparable with the Hittite state, but we have a lot of evidence that shows these, even fortified settlements characterized as Kashka whenever they changed their alliance, and cohabitation where Kashka people were clearly living in the same cities. And the trouble, of course, is that we, as of yet, don't have any material culture that we can identify as Kashka, but that whole hybridity that's now coming to the surface in the north, I think, is going to clarify the situation. And we see a lot of diversity there too, like what you found in Jide and then how different it is from the Oymach material and all of that. So I think this is getting a little clearer as it is. So.
Ilgi, this is another question for you. So since yesterday I've been thinking about the interplay between society and politics.
Yes.
And you started your talk by saying that you were going to be dealing with the social versus the political. But then you ended your talk basically by saying that these people had power to influence the state. And when I read from the outside, when I read these texts, they seem like very political texts in some sense. So I'm just curious to hear you distinguish a little bit more why this was particularly the social side and how you deal with the interplay between the two.
So a lot of the texts that one deals with in, or that we have available to us are, they have political agendas and they were produced for that purpose. But we do get a lot of information about the social landscape, about the identities and how interconnected they are with the politics of the region. But I think how I used it was to emphasize that I was not going to talk specifically about Hittite territorial management and how that worked, but rather the people there and how they interacted with the Hittite state and what their interests were. So I dealt more with that.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more.
This is a question for Alan. I'm not familiar with the sort of archaeology around these spaces that you're talking about, but I wonder, are there any kinds of evidence for sort of collaboration or cooperation that's not sanctioned by the state between the people who are living in the eastern borders or along the desert areas with these desert dwellers or marshland dwellers that are supposedly the enemy of the state, but they're actually working with some of the people who are supposed to be there protecting against them? Or is this such a ephemeral kind of archaeology that we don't really have anything that represents those people, and we can really have them from the state's perspective in written documents?
It's difficult speaking of the archaeology because, of course, the marshes are terrible, and then the sort of nomadic side of things, people are living light on the land generally. So in terms of archaeology, we've got less than we'd like to have. Although you do get in Dakhla Oasis, for instance, the people that the state is very interested in the Old Kingdom and exploiting and exploring for resources, basically. We know that there are semi-nomadic groups that go by the Sheikh Mufta, and that they would have been. We know that the state is worried about them because we have lots of watch posts. And then after a certain period of time, those watch posts start to be manned by the Sheikh Mufta, and we find, as we would expect, them being hired as guides. And I was very interested in sort of cultural patterns over the longue durée, so I did a lot of work kind of looking at narratives of desert travel from the sort of 18th century, 19th century, and there almost always you have these things where you hire as, basically, guardians, the people that if you didn't hire them, you would be attacked by. So some of it is kind of extrapolating from that, but you certainly get lots of interesting textual things with the Roman period of the villagers, who are, the state is being horrible to these villagers because the villagers are helping the bandits, and of course every time they help every time the state tries to eradicate them, then they want to help the bandits more, and so it's a self-perpetuating issue.
All right, well, thank you again to Ellen and Ilgi. We're having a coffee break now, and also presenters, we're going to have a group shot over here, I believe, really fast, so group photo really quickly.